here many times to hear Rick in the past. My name is Marcia Fraser. I'm the Special Collections Librarian here. And we're delighted to be able to bring you programs like this one today. It's always such a pleasure to have Rick with us because he's just such a fabulous speaker. He's our county historian. He's our gatherer and keeper of the collected history for Williamson County. And to me, he's what puts the color in local color. So I'll just remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Also, after the program, I'm sure there'll be time for a few questions, and there are books for sale up here. And so let's please give a warm welcome to Rick Warwick.
That may have been the best compliment I've ever heard, that I had color to something, because I'm usually a pretty bland guy. Refresh your memory, we have started out with the square in Franklin. Then we did a walk down West Main Street, which we started at 5 Points and ended up right just a little past 11th Avenue. And so today we're going to look at the north and east side of the square. And this is kind of a pictorial guide. I think people seem to appreciate photographs with a little bit of text rather than a lot of text and a few photographs. And I'm a much better collector of photographs than I am writing. And this has been a very fun project because, sadly enough, this part of town has been overlooked and neglected for so many years, even from the very beginning of our history in Franklin, which, you know, the first house was built in 1798 by Ewing Cameron on 2nd Avenue. And then we had, of course, White's Inn down at the corner of 1st Avenue and Bridge Street. But very early on, as early as 1825, we had an industrial cotton mill and a smelting facility for iron. And so over the years, it has not been the hoity-toity part of town. It's been an integrated, blacks and white live side by side in some occasions. Businesses and houses were side by side. So let's take a look at, and by the way, this the photograph you see at the front is kind of a part of that 1950 photograph, which tells us so much about Franklin in that period. And of course, you've got the mill over in the corner with the silos that are peeking through there, and we'll talk about that later. And it goes all the way down and catches a glimpse of Bridge Street, where we have the two jails side by side and the old county highway department. The De Beers map gives us such a great way of identifying what was what. Better go back a little bit. I'm skipping. If you bought a book, and I tried so hard this time to not have any mistakes in it, but Elaine, my wife, who's an eagle eye, and I'm sure Martha Lena's here, and she got an eagle eye and caught it on page 3 where I have the introduction, which is not in the PowerPoint, but I know that introduction has an R in it. I just know that it has. And it's on my computer when I sent it to the printer that the R was there. But I think the book probably ought to have a subtitle like The Mystery of the Missing R or something. But believe me, I can spell those kind of words. It's the others that give me trouble. But this area has a lot of history. And that's what we're going to look at. And I hope after this walk that we kindly take around town, I've kindly started down on Bridge Street, since that's where my office is in the old jail. And back to the what we call the Beers map. It's an 1878 production, but it's so helpful in identifying who was living where and what business was located in what location. And of course you can see there at the very end of East Main Street was the original Lilly Mill. That burned, and Mr. Lilly moved up the street a little bit there where the silos are today. This again is that aerial that I've taken. Now this was 1950, of course, and I've tried to go through and give you some clue as to what you're looking at. You notice up at the very top you'll see City Dump, and you can see there where next to the river a lot of things have been put in our river. The Harpeth is a beautiful river, and Franklin sits right in the elbow, the bend of the river, and a lot of nasty things have happened along the river over the years. But then you come to the Highway Department, which was right next to the jail number 4, which is McConnell's today, and then the jail number 5 is where the Heritage Foundation makes its home. And then you'll see that long white building was the cannery. Mr. Dorsey Crockett owned that lot, and the WPA, when they were in town, provided a facility where farmers could bring their produce in and get it canned. Schools were starting to have a lunch program, and so they raised a lot of vegetables out at the old county farm, which was where West Haven is today, and they would bring that produce in and can it, and then the schools would take it and use it during the year. And of course we've got over on what is East Margin or First Avenue, you'll see Anderson. Mr. Gene Anderson would have been there with where his automobile. Henry's drilling, of course, wouldn't have been there in 1950, but that started out as the cheese plant. And then, of course, over on 2nd Avenue, you see Middle Tennessee Electric. It's really been not really a good neighbor. They moved in there and started tearing down houses so that they could operate their business. I understand that that was what needed to be done at the time, to store their telephone poles and transformers and trucks, and it wiped out most of all the residential between 2nd Avenue and 1st Avenue. That's why we have today the Harpeth that's going in, and we could have complained more if there were really some nice buildings where that sits today, but honestly there really wasn't. Okay, here's, there have been 7 jails in Williamson County, and 5 of them have been on Bridge Street. The second and third was on the corner of 2nd and Bridge. There's kind of a parking lot there today where the senior citizens tore down a house to have some parking for their picnic area back there. And then of course in this picture you see the 1971-72 jail, which was built in the floodplain, and it flooded often. And of course the building, that 1942 building that the Heritage Foundation occupies today, and it's called the Leahy McGidd Center, thanks to some people sitting up front here. And then of course we've got the jail number 4, which was built in 1905, and it was built for $15,000. Williamson County has not splurged on jails and schools in those early days. Today they seem to be flush. So today you can see that other photograph at the bottom. That's our rather nice building, simple but useful. Right where the McConnell House is today, or the jail number 4, was White's Inn. And Benjamin White, the Whites were one of those early families. They were kin to Abram Maury, who founded our town. And they built that, Benjamin built that in 1803. And it was located there. It was demolished in 1904 so that they could build the jail. And you can see it was in pretty ragged condition at the time, but what can you expect for 100 years? Across the street from where we are today was on 111 Bridge Street, And this is an example of the working class homes that were in that part of town. And this, I think, when they were tearing it down a couple years ago, the center part of it was post and beam, and I think that'll make it the last post and beam house in Williamson County. It was early. It had been added on to. When this photograph was taken in the late 1960s, Malcolm Fox lived there, and I found that Mr. Warren had a broom factory in the back there in the 1930s. How many of y'all remember this building? When I came to town, I was fascinated because I could see that there was something more there than just an automobile workshop. And sure enough, I found in the early papers where this was Mr. White built that as a bakery. People in town didn't have ovens like we have today, and so the women would make their dough up and then let it rise and then take it down and have it baked in the ovens there. Today all we have is the rock foundation, and it sits right next to the river. I mean literally right on the river's edge, and next to that would be the bridge abutment that was there, was moved in 1928 up to where it is today on East Main Street. A lot of things were there. I know in 1853, Robert Rainey, who we'll talk about a little bit more, he had a steam-powered grist mill. The Beers map in 1878 shows Bailey Cody has a blacksmith shop there. Then later, the newspapers tell us that John Atwood had a broom factory there. O.R. Britton had a creamery there. That's where people brought their cream in, and he would take it and then he would sell it. D. McMahon had his blacksmith shop there. That's Linda Moore's grandfather. And then Gene Anderson was probably the last one there because you can see his advertisement over the door. Hopefully one day in the near future that will be part of the river walk that the city has planned that take you from Pinkerton Park all the way over to Harlansdale. I have been the luckiest person sometimes when it comes to people walking in with photographs. And this gentleman, I did not get his name, but he lives on Lewisburg Avenue Lewisburg Pike near Goose Creek. And he brought these two photographs in and he says, "I think you would like these." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, you bet." And this is the earliest photograph we have of the bridge. And this bridge, of course, was washed away in 1901. And then a iron truss bridge was put there. Now this big stone column you see in the middle is not there today. Nor on the Jeff Bethurem side of the river, you don't see that pile of rock or the abutment on that side, but on the First Avenue side, that abutment is still there. And you can see the bakehouse, which at that time was probably a blacksmith shop, there on the left side. Here are two photographs that are just perfect because they're right there where we're talking about. These are some girls and one little boy, I think, that are at the abutment at River's Edge. And then that's probably taken in the 1890s. Mrs. Bavard is the little girl in the white dress with the black hat. And that was her photograph she gave the Historical Society when she died. Then the next picture is just wonderful because that is a scene that was often occurred down at the river because right below the bridge was where the baptisms were in town. And this is Reverend William Moore is the guy with raising his hand, and he's about to dunk the convert there, and the church looks on. Now, if any of y'all remember reading Those Plumber Children by Miss Govan, which it's really the Eggleston children, but in there the cook takes the children down to watch the baptism that, from the Franklin Primitive Baptist Church over on the hill that we call Hard Bargain. This is a postcard of the last bridge that was on First Avenue. That stone curb there is still there today. And you'll notice that on the left-hand side, pedestrians walked on that path, and then buggies and eventually cars would go on the steel truss bridge. When the new bridge, the one we travel every day on East Main, when that was built, they took the iron bridge out to Arno Road and at Millview, and when I came to town in the 70s, that was that bridge. So it served its usefulness for many years. Right in the middle where, if you all remember where Henry Drilling was, the Wilson Cheese Company came here in 1936. And it was there until 1948 when it moved over on 11th Avenue behind where Robin Hood lives today and built there. This is an important industry because some of the small farmers who didn't have maybe 1 or 2 cows, they could take their milk and sell it here rather than to a dairy. Because if you had several cows, the truck would come and pick up your cans, empty them, or take them with them and then exchange them. Or you could bring your whatever amount of milk you had here, and I think they made the cheese right there. And this was demolished in 1917 when they started the Harpeth Square. 2017. J.W. Little Dairy, some of you all remember that building. It was just torn down a couple of years ago. But Mr. J.W. Little Sr. had his cows and farm over, of course, on Concord Road where Vance used to live, Little. And then you can see here the trucks, because it hadn't been too many years ago that milk was actually delivered to your door. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, inside you see that they were processing the milk, homogenizing, sterilizing it, making it where it was suitable for consumption. And all the schools, Mr. Little furnished all the Williamson County schools with milk on half pints, and then on Friday, if you were good, you got chocolate milk. And when I was going to school, it was 2 cents a half pint. And I probably was here too. The Sandburg Maps are the insurance maps that we have, and believe me, they are the most valuable source of identifying the changes that have happened over the time. Now this is in September of 1928, and you notice they're still using the Nashville Pike Bridge on First Avenue, but they're in the process of building the new bridge, which we call today the Memorial Bridge. I don't think, it's a little off, I don't think that angle is that sharp coming into East Main. But right there on the corner, you'll see where Little's used to be was Mr. Craig's Lumber Company. And Mr. Craig, Frank Craig, was the man responsible for building the Franklin Theater, and he built a lot of homes in Franklin, particularly out Lewisburg Avenue. And he was in competition with Mr. Farnsworth, who also was a major builder and supplier of supplies. But you see, they were making all of that right there on the corner of East Main and First Avenue, almost halfway down. And then, of course, you can see where the Franklin booksellers, there is the little house behind it there where the parking lot is today, was there. It's no longer there today. And then, of course, the houses in the center were all taken by Middle Tennessee Electric in the 50s and 60s. This is I try to save, whenever time I get my hands on a business receipt, this is the letterhead for the Craig and Williams contractor and builders. And this planing mill, we'll see a better picture of it later, but it's set right there on First and east margin. And you can see on the Sandburg map what it looked like. In 1915, Frank and his brother Craig took over that corner from their father and Mr. Green Williams. And of course, this is a photograph of that. Later before that, Mr. Jake Fisher was the operator of that, and he built many of the houses in this town in the 1880s and 90s and first part of the 20th century. But notice the timber yeah, I believe you're right. Calvin knows timber when he sees it laying on the ground. Yeah. His dad cut a lot of it. In 1928, the Lebanon Bridge Company, who was Mr. Jess Andrews, was the superintendent. He got the bid. They were building what we call today Franklin Road or Highway 31 or the Jackson Highway, Nashville to Franklin, on to south of town to Columbia and Pulaski. He built 3 bridges for $75,000. He built the bridge over the Little Harpeth right there at Murray Lane and Franklin Road. Then he came down to Spencer's Creek there at back where McHatcher comes through on the Franklin Road. And then he built the bridge that we're still using today, 90 years later, $50,000. And here's his crew of workers that built the bridge. Thanks to Patty Andrews, she grew up out where Sullivan Farms is today, and she came to a historical society meeting, and we got to talking about who she was, and she said that her dad built the bridges. And I said, oh, do you have any photographs of him? And she said, yes. And so she was able to furnish me with these scenes of actual building the bridge. And this is just wonderful because they were really building it by hand. There's a concrete mixer there that they're mixing the concrete with, and of course you get in the background, you can see Lilly Mill there. They're on the north side of the bridge looking back towards town. On this other side, they're on the Franklin side looking over to what the BGA lower campus is today, or the old Harpeth School. At that time, probably Reverend Reams was living there. Here's some more. On the picture at the bottom there on your left, that was Sophronia Park. Mr. Harsh German, who was from an old family here in town, he loved to grow flowers, and so when this was built, he went down and had a garden there, and it also was a tourist camp. The city provided showers and a place for people coming down with a trailer, tourists, and they could pull in there and spend the night. And of course, this other one on the right-hand side, that is where Earl's fruit stand was before it was filled in. So you can see the bank there was very gradual instead of the way it is today. This is another great scene of, it's a snow, and it was probably, I don't know what month, but anyways, you look over there and you can see on the left will be Lilly Mill, and then right ahead you will see Mr. Mangrum had a store there on the corner, and then in the background you can see the Masonic Hall, and that's just a great photograph. Soon as the building was built in 1929, there was a great flood, and you can see how there was a 30-foot between the normal level of the river up to the bottom of the bridge, and you can see it just did make it. That's in 29. Then over in the big flood we've had was in February of 1948, and you can see all the flooding goes all the way to the silos there on where Lilly Mill stood. And then of course you can see the sign Highway 31, and you can see the water looks to me like it's going over the bridge. This is Earl. Earl Tidewater was really an institution in town. He started out right at the side of the road, and by the time he finished, it went all the way almost to the railroad track. But he was a really young entrepreneur when he started in the 50s, and he really, I think, he made Halloween and pumpkins a real part of our life that I don't think it was there before him. His large pumpkins would weigh 1,000 pounds or more. He would bring them in from, he never would tell where, but they didn't come from here. And he provided fresh fruit. And then this is across the street. And I was so glad when Miss Gathman died, I was given her photographs, which she wanted me to have. And I had never seen this one before. And of course, Dr. Gathman came here in 40, and you can see that he is there in that little building on the corner, right on the corner. Then the photograph above, you'll see Mr. Zach Green had a cafe, which was right across the street from O'Brien Brothers. Now, there were about 200 women at one time working there. And see, when they had a lunch break, you had to feed them quick. So there were many. Miss Dotson, of course, was there in that area, and others. But Zach was there. Then Mr. Wharf, L.D. Wharf, had he was a mechanic. He was there. And of course, Miss Ivy Holt, she was still there at Amico Station when I came to town. Then number 5 there, that's Dr. Gathman's office. Number 6 was the Riverview Club. And it was one of those honky-tonks that between Brentwood and Franklin, there were 15 honky-tonks in the 30s and the 40s. Particularly in the 1940s during World War II, Nashville, was a hub because of the railroad system, and so it was not unusual for soldiers to be brought in, and they may have to spend 2 or 3 days before they could get out. And of course, what better thing to do than get on the interurban and ride out Franklin Road and hit every honky-tonk till you got to where you couldn't go any further. But that's a great. This is the way it looks today. That's not as bad as it was. It could be better, but it no longer the boathouse where we had, we're miles away from a lake, but they seem to be able to supply boats. This again is the 1950 aerial, and I've kind of zoomed in a little bit to this area between 1st and 2nd Avenue South and Church Street. But let's start. Number 1, of course, Lilly Mill. We'll see more about it in a minute, but it was a major economic impact. Not only did it provide work for a lot of the people in town, particularly the black workers, but it also was an economic engine for farmers. Those silos were a great source for farmers to bring their grain in and either sell it or store it in the silos. We'll talk more about them in a minute. Then we've got number 2, and of course that is Gallery 202, which is we call Clouston Hall, and it is really a remarkably architectural treasure, I think, in town. Number 3, of course, that is Bucket of Blood, and we're going to talk about more of that in a minute, but that was Mr. Lilly built those for his workers so they would be close to their work. And if they didn't show up, all they had to do was walk across the street. Number 5, of course, that is the Mule Barn. Number 4. Number 5, of course, is the Masonic Hall, which again is another city treasure and a really national landmark. Then number 6 is, of course, St. Philip's Catholic Church, and in between those two is the rectory where the priests lived. Then number 7, of course, would have been where R.C. Alexander got his start in the filling station business. And then number 8 is the Franklin booksellers, or we call it the old factory store. And then number 9, of course, would be where the O'Brien brothers would have been. And then number 10, of course, is Mr. Mangrum or Mr. Hardison's store was in that location. And apparently that store got hit many times because there is a curve in the road. I don't think we notice it so much today, but it wasn't unusual for speeders to be coming into town and end up hitting, not making the curve. This really is a national landmark. The old factory store with the columns and the pediment there. It looks like a Greek temple. And it was built in the 1820s to serve as an outlet store for the cotton mill, the granary, and the foundry. At one time, it was a grocery store. In one Sandburg Map, it is called a Negro pool hall and nightclub. It was an antique store at one time, a restaurant, a jewelry store, a coffee shop, a bank, and since 2005, Landmark Booksellers with Joel and Carol Tomlin. And of course, in our time, Miss Dotson's was there from 1954 to 1978. So it is an important part of the area we're talking about. The Shea House sadly was torn down in 1950 to make way for the motel. Mr. Bethune saw a need for a motel in Franklin because before the interstate, everybody traveling Chicago, coming down to Nashville through Franklin and on south, had to have a place to stop and spend the night. And so this house was sacrificed, and it was an early house, 1811. There is a good possibility that was one of the finest old houses. The Shays lived there, and this is the Shay was one of those Irish families that came here before the Civil War when the railroad was being built, and they stayed. And Miss Nell Shay taught at Franklin High School. She was actually served as principal when it first started, and she taught there for many years and was beloved by all. Of course, this is the Franklin Motel. Mr. Bethune, Billy Bethune, started it, and then he sold it to Gerald and Vera Smithson. And they operated it on up until a few years before it was demolished in 1977 to make way for the Bank of Franklin. Today it's a parking lot, but it'll be part of the hotel entrance. So better things are going to happen there in that spot. This is Landmark Community Bank, and it was located at the corner of 2nd Avenue and East Main. It occupied the site where R.C. Alexander started his Texaco station, and then, of course, it was replaced in 1977. It started out as the Bank of Franklin, and it architecturally, it probably is out of place here because it kind of has a Williamsburg flair. I think that was the idea when they built it. Supposedly it's going to get a facelift when they get through building the hotel. This is kind of an aerial. This was taken almost a year ago. So there's been a lot of work going on that block between 1st and 2nd and East Margin and Bridge Street. And we'll just have to wait and see. This Ben Johnson is a local artist, and he cannot be complimented enough. He has an eye, he has a great flair about his presentation there, but this is his idea of what that was going to look like, and when they get through, it probably will. Where J.J. Wine Bar is today was once the home of John Truitt, and this was located at the corner of 2nd and East Margin. And it was built in 1899, and there is the family of John and Mittie Truett with their daughter and grandchildren. Some of y'all may remember the Payne, Jamie Payne and Martha Payne. But we remember John Truett Sr. today more because of what happened in 1925. Mr. Truett was one of the respected citizens in town. He was a city alderman. He was a responsible businessman, everyone thought. But his reputation crashed when he was accused of hiring the murder of Deputy Sam Locke for raiding his moonshine stills. And Truett, surprisingly, was found not guilty by a local jury. He later was found guilty by a federal jury, but not for having anything to do with the killing of Mr. Locke. And the Historic Society has just recently placed a historical marker on Hillsborough Road near the intersection of Sneed Road, and I hope you will stop and read it. The Locke family came to me and said they thought their ancestor needed to be honored. He was a man killed in service. He was a deputy, and he was breaking up stills at a rapid pace, and he got discouraged because the sheriff was on the take. The moonshiners were paying him off, and so he was trying to pull back. So Locke resigned and went to work for the feds, and they really did cause a lot of heartache and headache for the moonshiners in the county. And in the 1920s, every hollow had a moonshine still just about in this county. If there was any water there and it was secluded enough, somebody was going to be making whiskey there. Mr. Truett's livery stable was infamous, I guess, because if you'll read in the newspaper in the 20s, they were always being raided for card games and bootlegging. And it's kind of interesting today, J.J. Ashley's can have a wine bar and it's legal. So it's just a matter of time, isn't it? This is that area where the stables were, Truett Stables, and then there was a restaurant in there, and then of course where right above the red car there was a Sinclair Station. Today, pretty much it's there. Many of y'all remember probably McCall Electric was at that site. And, I'm going to call it, Sewell. Bob Sewell and Ruth. And of course this little building is really a treasure. I get a warm feeling every time I pass it. It is so small, and yet it has been so useful over the years. It's probably one of our earliest public buildings. Many of y'all may be old enough to remember Captain Tom Henderson, who used that office for 60 years. And the Heritage Foundation was there from 1968 to 1995. And today it's being used for the Main Street program in Franklin. Jill Bergen that's her headquarters. And it's so glad that it was saved. Okay, the Catholic Church, St. Philip's, was built in 1869, but it was consecrated in 1871. It was really a congregation mainly made up of Irish immigrants with names like Dempsey, Shea, Malloy, Haggerty, Lyons, Riley, could go on. Today the congregation is the largest in Franklin. It's over 4,000. Now it's hard to really pin down because the Catholics keep their roles different from the Protestants in they count families, not individual members. You'll notice there the sanctuary is really a Gothic design. The windows have the arch. And then, of course, a Shea House was turned into the rectory where the priests lived at this period. And then, of course, some of y'all may remember the Malloy House, which faced East Main, and it was right next to the sanctuary, and it later became the parish center for that. And then, of course, John Bragg moved it out on Highway 96 towards Linton, right on the county line between Davidson County and Williamson County. And this is a photograph. I was so lucky one night. I was speaking at a group of Catholics at St. Philip's, and there was a Malloy girl there that introduced herself. And I said, "Oh, by any chance, do you have any photographs?" And she says, "Well, I don't, but my aunt does." And so she came back the next week and brought me some of the best photographs. And this is the Malloy family, Martin Malloy. That's a small house, and he had a large family, but it was really part of Franklin for many, many years. O'Brien's, 1936. Now, Franklin has always been a draw for industry because a lot of these country folks needed a job and they were willing to work cheap. And this building at the end, which was built by W.F. Truett, was available. And so the city got it and rented it to O'Brien's. And they started out at 21 cents an hour for 100 ladies. Then the war came along, and they got the contracts to make uniforms, particularly khaki shirts and pants. And so you'll see there how they worked in those conditions. I do not know. But one of the newspapers said that they made $12 a week for 40 hours of work. And believe me, that was hard work. My mother was a seamstress at Levi's, and she would come home with blue hands from holding all that denim. In 1945, O'Brien went back to Nashville, and they sold this plant to the Middle Tennessee Garment Company, and it was continued on up to the 1950s. Then this building was replaced in 1973 for the first Franklin Federal Bank, which later was replaced by St. Philip's. And this is 1973. I went to that opening, and it was really a nice building. Again, it has a Greek temple effect. Mr. Paul Ogilvie, of course, was the president. Mr. Tom Harlan was the chairman of the board. And Leonard McKay was the secretary, and C.D. Berry was general counsel. This institution had $10 million in assets. And today, this is the St. Philip's Catholic Church main sanctuary, and they have plans to do some work there. They need additions. They're growing. In the spot on the corner of First Avenue and East Main, across from what is the Catholic Church today, you'll see the filling station. This is Mr. James Givens, and this was the Gulf Station. He later moved on the other side of the street, and I don't know why. When I came to town, Mr. Pack Roberts had his filling station there, and then, of course, then Dotson's would have been next door. But in the background, you can see at the silos there where it says Franklin Lady, and that was one of the main brands for Lilly Mill. And this, of course, is a good shot of Lilly Mill, and I've got a letterhead there that I've cropped, and you'll see the building, and you can see one of the sacks for the Franklin Mills was Lilly. And of course, you see they catch on with the name. And Mr. Lilly had established that in '68. Then it burned, and then he moved down about the middle of the block. And Mr. Charlie Korn and Mr. Aiken came here from Winchester, and in 1909. Then Dudley Casey bought it from the Korn brothers in 1945. And the only thing that survives today, of course, is the silos, and they were built in 1926 at a cost of $60,000. And I see I've got a zero out of place, but supposedly they held 240,000 bushels. And of course, 1958, a big fire at Lilly Mill. it really put a strain on the Franklin Volunteer Fire Department. They had just bought some new hoses and a new pump, and this was the first big fire. And they said Johnny Smith, who was the head of the fire department, said he had the nozzle, and he said, "Let her go." And when it did, it lifted him up off the ground, and he was, it was like something from the Keystone Cops. But it burned, and within an hour, of course, you see all that dust that from the granary was combusted and just boom. And I want to thank Evelyn Lunn for these photographs. And then, of course, this is a picture today of a landmark in Franklin. Maybe Mr. Ligon will think of something useful besides just a monument. It's hard for us to realize today the importance of tobacco in Williamson County, but it was a cash crop from all levels. There were the big farmers who had plenty of help, labor was cheap, and they would do acres and acres, and then there were the little farmers out in the countryside on the hillside would grow, a quarter of an acre tobacco, or tenths, as it was even broken down into. And there were 3 warehouses that you could bring your tobacco to be sold. Jewel had two of them, one over at Hard Bargain and one out Columbia Avenue. And then the Williamson County Loose Leaf Tobacco Company and warehouse was on First Avenue South. And you can see what a large building that was. Unfortunately, it caught on fire. And that was in 68, I believe, and boom. One of the great economic disasters of Franklin in the 1880s was the Franklin Sugar Mill. A group of guys got together and said, "Man, there's money to be made in sugar." And so they sold stock in this company. They raised about $75,000. Now in the 1880s, that was a lot of money. And they set up down there near the railroad, because that was a good place to be, it's for shipping. And again, this is a Malloy photograph showing the mill, and it never produced any sugar. Molasses, yes. Everything that could go wrong went wrong on this. The machinery would break. The farmers had been contracted to grow the cane, and when they went to bring it to the mill was broken down, and they couldn't take the wagon's load of sugar cane. So it was a great loss to a lot of people in Franklin. It caused really an economic depression. Miss Sarah English loaned me these 2 photographs, and I'm very thankful that I got to know her. But her father had, you'll see there, the tall building where it says English Warehouse. Mr. English had been near the depot, and then he and Mr. Sam Fleming's father, Sam Fleming Sr., were partners, and eventually English sold out and started his own company. But you can see the railroad track right there in the corner, and that field between the railroad track and First Avenue looks like it's been plowed. Then the other picture is from Fort Granger looking over the town. And I'm sorry the trees are in the way, but because there's a lot of things I'd like to see there that's can't be seen. This was the photograph Miss Sarah let me copy, and it's the English Mill, and you can see the little office there. Mr. English is with the white shirt and the tie, and the building in the back, and that's where he and Mr. Fleming had a partnership. And then this aerial photograph was also her brother, Zellner, climbed up into the silos of the granary and took a picture of this in 1917, and you can see the courthouse and of course the water tank, which was right behind the courthouse even when I came in 70. And then number 3, of course, is the back of the Masonic Hall. And then, of course, we got the rectory and the church. And then you'll see the rooftops there of the Bucket of Blood. And again, the Sandburg Map is so useful in identifying where things were. And you can see right there in the middle where it says Lilly Alley. Well, those are the 6 buildings that were part of the bucket of blood. Now, locals tell me that Pig Hodge stabbed a guy one Saturday night, and they put the guy on the table, and the blood ran off into a bucket, and that's where it got the term bucket of blood. But all these houses down on First Avenue and Church Street there, and part of Second Avenue, were all neighborhoods for African Americans. And then, of course, you can see the Masonic Hall and the Catholic Church, and then, of course, it's got the produce and the store on the corner, and a good view of the silos and the shape of the building, and the railroad spur that went through there. And if you read the papers, they are shipping carloads of grain out of Franklin. Williamson County was one of the major producers of corn, wheat, millet, and a lot of farmers depended on being able to sell their crop at Lilly Mill. Thelma Battle has loaned me these 6 pictures, and this is inside the bucket. And you can see in the background some of the buildings, the Masonic Hall there, and families had their own little community there. It's hard to believe, but before Middle Tennessee Electric, before Franklin Power and Light, we had the Harpeth Electric Company. And this was located near Lilly Mill because the manager and owner of it was William Pryor Lilly. And you can see there the first 30 horsepower engine that he had, and then he souped it up to 250. And this provided electricity mainly for just like electric lights. There weren't really any big equipment. You didn't have electric stoves and that till later. But Miss Harry McCullough's father, Mr. Benny Hunter, in the stack of papers that she gave me, you can see there he's paying $1.15 a month for electricity. So we'll go back to those days, won't we? This is an interesting house. It was a very early house. I had a hard time tracing it down, but it's at the corner of Church Street and First Avenue. Today it's painted white. Mr. Ligon owns that building and the warehouse behind it. But it goes back pretty early. That whole part of that block was 13, 14, and 23 was sold to John Miller. And then in 1855, John Pugh, who ran the foundry, and he's the one I think responsible for making the columns at the courthouse, the fluted columns. And then in 1919, the city bought that, and that's where they kept their storage for the water department and so on. And it looks like something right out of Ireland with the doorway and the 3 windows, brick. And then the picture over there is one that shows it in better condition with the porches on it. They have just been taken off over time. I went through, if you'll get the book, you'll be able to go through and identify these houses. I did try to photograph every one. Some of the numbers have changed from what's on the Sandburg Map and what's on the mailboxes today, so you'll have fun with that. Many of these houses, though, were also workers for at the mill, so they were close by. On the corner, we call the Rainey House of South Margin and First Avenue. It's a marvelous house, built in 1839. Luckily, I have a picture of Mr. Robert Rainey and his wife. He ran a restaurant right across from the depot, which was handy for travelers. He also had a grocery store, and I told you earlier that he had a grist mill further up on First Avenue. He and his wife Martha died on the same day, and apparently they were maybe destitute, but they're both buried in the same grave over at Mount Hope. The house was in really bad shape when I first moved here, and soon after that, Miss Ruby Bateman, who later became Miss Uthman, she had retired from the Metro school system. She was over the PE department, and she came here and bought this little house, and she asked for Gert Uthman, her boyfriend, when she was going to school. He was married to someone else, and his wife died, and then he married Ruby, and they were the greatest couple. And Gert was such a great craftsman. He brought all of his furniture that he had made, and that house was a treasure. Andy Bateman lives there today. And of course, some of y'all may miss Mr. Jack Plant. Really, this was his headquarters, right at the corner next to the Rainey House. But Jack Plant was the one that hooked up most of people's plumbing and particularly propane gas when it came to town. Now we're going back to, this is the 1928 Sandburg Map, and this will show you how important the railroad was in Franklin. You see the little building there, number 6, is the passenger station, and then the long building, number 7, was the freight, and it's still there today. 1959, I think L&N did away with passenger travel through Franklin, and they did away with the building. Unfortunately, it's a shame. It should have, if it was still there, we could really make use of it. Number 8, of course, is the old chicken plant, and number 9 is the ice plant. Of course, you see there number 4, they were delivering gasoline and put in the tanks there, and then the filling stations, I guess, would fill it up from there. These are some great pictures, I think, of Franklin Depot. You're getting it from different angles, and then I've pulled out from the Sandburg Map the floor plan. The eaves, come out from the roof long enough where people could probably stand around and wait on the train without getting wet. And of course, you can see the close connection between the railroad bed, the tracks, and the depot. This was important. I got a feeling maybe some of y'all have heard of Uncle Harry Marsh, who was the last black taxi in town that used a horse and buggy. He lived over at Hard Bargain, and I've talked to a lot of young kids that grew up on Fair Street, and he would come down 11th Avenue, and the kids would get on the back of the buggy and ride all the way up to 5th Avenue and get off and walk back. Luckily, Calvin Lehue had acquired that taxi, and today it's in our county museum, and I encourage you to go by and take a look at it because it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. This is the freight depot, and you notice it has changed. The entrance used to be on the north end facing Nashville, and today, of course, it's been changed to the side. But it was built in 1873, and we know that because I found it in the Williamson County News. It had been misidentified, saying that it was a pre-Civil War building, and you could just look at it and tell that wasn't so. And then, of course, these are the workers that were the freight clerks. And there was a lot of freight coming through Franklin. Particularly, you had Mr. Martin Torner was shipping out tomatoes and green beans and up north. And then, of course, lumber was going out, the granaries. And, of course, this is across the railroad track. And this has been many things. It's the Barn Door Antiques. It was Mr. Fleming's granary at one time. Mr. R.N. Moore ended up with it. And it was the Plantation Club, and I think the VFW was there. There we go. Mr. Moore is really an important R.N. Moore, Sr., came here in 1928 to work at the ice plant. And he didn't take him long to realize he could make more money running his own business, and he did quite well with the People's Coal Company. And you'll see there his card says, "A black business handled white," which is a little play on words there. And he says, "Our business is black, but we will treat you white." And that was in one of the review. Today, J.J. Ashley is located in those buildings. Of course, some of them are no longer there. This is what it looks like today. This faces South Margin, and at one time even Mr. Farnsworth had the building. And these are some of the houses that are on South Margin that are no longer residences but have turned into businesses. On the corner of South Margin and 2nd Avenue, that was the headquarters for Mr. Martin Torner. And he is really a legend in town. The country folks still talk about dealing with him, and they seem to always have a good report. He contracted with a lot of farmers, particularly out in the 1st District, to raise tomatoes for him, and then he would guarantee them a certain price. He would buy them, pack them, and ship them, and make some money. And all that happened on this. Now, he was at both ends of 2nd Avenue, because he was also on the north side of 2nd Avenue, right behind where we are today, in his junkyard. But this was his business headquarters. And of course, these are some of the houses that are on the south side of North Margin. And this is Clouston Hall. This is probably, if I had a choice of any house I would live in, this would probably be it. In 1828, it was built by E.G. Clouston. Right before the Civil War, it became Oscar Reams. He was a merchant in town. And then after the war, it was Henry Gray. Then Dr. Cliff Jr. was there. Then banker Joe Briggs. And these photographs came from Joe Briggs' granddaughter, who was kind enough to give them to me. And then, of course, artist Bun Gray. Many of you all remember him. And then today, and there is a great mistake. I don't know how I got Kelly Harwell's. It's Kelly Harwood. I think I was thinking of our Speaker of the House when I did that. Across the street, we call this the greenhouse today, but it's there, and it was the last African-American family to live in downtown Franklin. Miss Bobby House was the last to call this home, to own the piece of property. And you can see Munch House and Dorsey House bought that in I believe 1906. Yeah, 06. And then he had a son, J.D., and J.D. played in the band, was really the leader of the band for the Patent Leather Kids. And you see Fred Williams, who was a really remarkable guy who lived on Natchez Street and 11th Avenue. He is playing the trumpet, and Bobby is playing the piano. And some of y'all may remember, if you went by there, sometimes you would hear music coming out of the house, and it was Bobby in there playing on the piano. Right next door, where Pull Type Players is today, that started out as the Wiley Memorial Methodist Church, USA. Right after the Civil War, the Northern Methodists sent down missionaries, and even during the war, particularly in Nashville, and they came here and started the Freedmen Bureau schools, but they also were building churches across the county. And this church, we've got a picture of it before the tornado of 1925, and then you'll see right after it was sold, the roof was lowered, and it became Five Ash Market for many years, and then of course the Maple Fox Antiques, and Joel Tomlin had the Maple Fox restaurant there. And then of course the city acquired the building, and it has been used as the Pull Type Players group for over 50 years. Well, that is a 50-year-old group. They haven't always been there. But what happened with this church, there is the AME Church, they were across the street, which is the African American Methodist. But this AME Church was a black congregation with a white bishop. And if they were existing today, they would be part of the Tennessee Conference, just like Ebenezer, the Methodist Church in Nolensville, is part of the Tennessee Conference, and also Beech Grove out on Arno Road in the Grove. They are members of the Tennessee Conference. So it's a black congregation with a white bishop, where the AME is a black congregation with a black bishop. Dr. Cliff, he's one of my favorite 19th century people, and this is his house, and it stood about where the parking lot is for the First Tennessee Bank. And you can see Dr. Cliff there with his great-granddaughter, Josephine Cliff, who turned out to be Miss Sam Fleming. And then apparently one of the little servant girls is standing there. And down at the bottom is right before the house was moved down the street. You get a good vision of what it looked like. And then, of course, there's Dr. Cliff with his son, grandson, and great-grandson. Dr. Cliff was remarkable. He joined the Confederate 20th Tennessee, became the surgeon. He was captured at Mill Springs. He volunteered to take General Zolcoffer back to Nashville, who had been killed at Mill Springs, and he resigned his commission and changed sides. He became one of the leading Republicans in Williamson County, and he also was president of the National Bank in Franklin, and he was also president of the Nashville-Decatur Railroad. So quite a man, plus he practiced medicine as well. This is the parking lot on 2nd Avenue, and this would have been part of the Cliff property and also the Cameron property. Ewan Cameron, which we'll mention him, we have a historical marker down there, built the first house in Franklin in 1798. And his house was torn down. John B. McEwen tore it down in 1873. And today the parking garage sits there. Of course, one of the really national landmarks that we have is the 3-story Gothic Masonic Hall. And of course, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson used the Masonic Hall as the location to negotiate with the Chickasaw delegation that came here, and that treaty that was signed here was never ratified by the Senate, so it fell to the next Van Buren administration before it was settled. And this is a wonderful picture, an early picture, and there's only a couple people in there I can identify. The little man in the very center, that's Dr. Nolan. And the man with the white apron is Mr. Hahn, who was the principal at Franklin Elementary. We talked about the Mule Barn. It's hard to imagine that Williamson County would have many mules, but it was a really mule center. And right next to the Masonic Hall was the Mule Barn. Fats Thompson was the owner, and these others I think were partners that you see the pictures there. That Mo Covington you see there had an interesting thing happen to him. They had mule sales there, and he was kidnapped by somebody in Alabama and taken to Alabama and worked down there as a slave, literally, for 10 years. And one day, a truck driver who had also been at that sale recognized him, and he got him in the truck and brought him back to Franklin. So indentured servitude is still with us. The houses here, you see the Mule Barn, and then, of course, Andrew Patton, Clifton Ball, who worked for the Harpeth Bank, and, of course, you see William German, and then right on the very corner, Thompson and Baker had a car lot there. This is an interesting thing. William Perkins was a slave of William O'Neill Perkins, who owned up where we call the O'More campus today, in that house. And he bought that house and gave it to William Perkins for his service during slavery. Perkins started the first African American church in Franklin over on the hill on Mount Hope Street, and later it became the home of Miss Andrew Patton. Today it is part of the Brownstones, but it's much older than the period. You can see that central hall with the two bays tells you, and when there was an L in the back, tells you that it was a pretty early house. This building sits where the Mule Barn sat, and of course it's the educational center for the St. Philip's Church, and it's named after Father Arnold, who served there as rector for many years. And of course this is the second church of the Methodist Church. The Methodists have been in Franklin on, now 4 different locations. They started out on 1st Avenue and Church Street, then they moved to 2nd Avenue and Church Street, then they moved to 5th Avenue and Church Street, and now they're at 5th Avenue, and also the main church is out Nashville Pike and McHatcher. But we're fortunate enough to get that photograph because it was really a nice building. After they built the 5th Avenue Church in the 1870s, they sold it to the Shorter Chapel AME Church. And they stayed there until 1925. And they needed to move where more blacks lived, so they moved down on Folk Street and Natchez Street in 1925. And they tore down the building, and the congregation carried those brick by brick, through the town down to Natchez Street and built their church. Now this school that you see there, before the school was on Natchez Street, it was on 2nd Avenue in this church. And we're so fortunate. This is a photograph that Thelma Battle had that was given to her by Fred Williams. And today, of course, the Brownstones has now occupy the 2nd Avenue, 1st Avenue, and Bridge Street. And of course, these are some of the houses that I've identified. The Davis Wooldridge house, I think, is probably the oldest house in town. It's possibly built as early as 1810. And it's a beauty. The Bearden House, where John and Carol Robinson lived, the Heritage Foundation bought that. I think the city actually owned it, and the Heritage bought it and had Bill Powell restore it, and then they sold it to John and Carol. But it was known as the old Bearden House, and it was built in 1886, and that's Mr. Bearden and three of his children. And of course, this is the house that I really like. Robert Davis, who was a Methodist minister and also a teacher, had a school here in Franklin. This was his home, and later it was owned by Loring H. Wooldridge, who is remarkable because he served 4 years in the Civil War, and he joined at the age 61. Makes me tired just to think about it. This is the house that Rudy and Peter moved from up the street, Dr. Cliff's house. They moved it down, took the porch off, and made it really look like it belongs in Williamsburg. It is not the early house that they think it is. They thought it was going to be Cameron's house, but I proved to her that it wasn't. But the little house that you see right there above there, that house was falling in. And so Rudy tried to find a lot real quick because the bulldozer was really ready to push that Cliff house down. And she got permission to hold off until they could tear down this house, which had been the Prinzel house, to move that into that lot. Wow. Down at the corner of South Margin and 2nd Avenue, there's been a lot of things going on there. You see, we had the Depot Mill, which was a granary. Then it became the ice place, and then it became the Dixie Chicken Processing Probably not many people remember that. From 1954 to 1964, thousands and thousands of chickens were processed there. And you can see the truck that they came up from Georgia. And one night in December 1954, they made the bridge was collapsed, and people had to go Eddie Lane for a couple years. Here are some buildings that are between East Main and Bridge Street, and over the years the houses have been torn down and replaced with commercial buildings, and it's not for the better, I'm afraid. But Miss Bavard's house, Frances Bavard, died, and the Review Appeal bought that house and then built their building, which is now Winchester Antiques. And the next house, 133, was torn down, and we have what was the Farnsworth building, and then Ron Schuff's building. He owns both of those today. I dedicated this book, if you buy the book you'll see in the front, to Bethenia Maury, who was a niece of the Commodore, Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was the Pathfinder of the Sea, probably the most important man to grow up in Franklin and go off to make a name for himself. And she died in 1941, I think. She was like 99 years old. And also John Henry Eaton, who lived where the Catholic Church is today, but he is probably the most important man to come out of Franklin. He was a U.S. Senator from Tennessee, and he also served in Jackson's cabinet as Secretary of War. He served as Territorial Governor of Florida, and he was a very important man in Washington. Here are some other houses that are on Bridge Street, and you pass those every day, and many of them have been turned over to businesses rather than residents, I'm sorry to say. And then, of course, these are the 134, of course, was our old home place for the Heritage Foundation for about 3 years. And the coffee shop is on the corner, and then in between those is a building that shouldn't be there, but it's there. Riverside Antiques, of course, is the home of Colonel Fulton Beasley. And Colonel Beasley captivated the audience every Saturday morning with his community auction, and did that until 1982. 1957 and 1982. The Crockett, Dorsey Crockett's cannery, which was there on the corner, was torn down, and Mr. Torner built that building. It's been kind of glamorized there with the stucco, but anyways, Fulton Beasley was really an important institution with his, I can hear him now. Who's going to make a bid? And of course, Martin Torner, this is down at the junkyard. And of course, if you were a young boy that wanted to sell your skins, he bought almost anything that had fur. And young boys made a good living off of that. If you dug ginseng, you picked up walnuts, you brought them to Martin Torner. And this is the operation. You see the sack of walnuts there, and he would take them and hull them. And this is at the end of the street, and this was known as Eggleston's Bottom, and it's at North Margin and 2nd Avenue. And you can see there those houses were mainly African Americans, and every time it flooded, it got into their homes. William Montgomery took these pictures in 1948, and Mary and Claudia were kind enough to let me use these. But these were the conditions of living in Franklin near the river. And I think that's it. And I will take questions if you're not too personal. Anybody have a question? Boy, I didn't realize that many people. Somebody must have slipped in while I was. Yes.
You mentioned West Haven. It used to be the county environmental community.
It was the county poorhouse.
Poorhouse.
Yeah, you wouldn't know it today, would you?
When was it no longer?
From 1936 to 1958, I think. And hadn't been many years. Well, when they started West Haven, they tore down the little houses, and I mean they really were shacks. The Perrys used them to store grain in and stuff like that. But yes, the original poorhouse, of course, was in Stillhouse Hollow. And in 1936, they sold that and came to town. Better land, closer to town. They could keep a better watch on the inmates. And the state of Tennessee, I think 1835 or 34, mandated that every county had to provide a poorhouse for people who couldn't take care of themselves. Now the idea was they bought the farm, they had a manager, usually his wife did the cooking and anyone else that was able. And then if you were able to work, you had to work. But if you read in the census, many of them were invalids, idiots, handicapped in some way and just couldn't work. Of course, during the WPA period, they had a lot of gardens out there. Now, the ground is very rich there on Boyd Mill Pike. And then in 58, what happened, it got down to, I think there were 2 patients that were there, and the county realized, let's get out of this business. So they put them in a nursing home and sold the farm to Paul and Melton Perry. Anybody else? Yes, Michael?
On the 1898 Sandburg Map, at the corner of First and East Main, where St. Philip's is today, it shows a tobacco works.
Yeah.
Do you know if any tobacco products were made here?
Oh, yeah, we had, if you look on the 1850 census, there were several tobacconists, they were called, and particularly the Owens out on Owen Hill Road. They later went on to Eagleville and had a factory there, but there were some.
What did they make?
Well, it was like you would take and make twist tobacco. Probably, you would season the tobacco for making cigars or cigarettes, but mainly it was probably loose tobacco. People smoked pipes back then rather than cigarettes. Anybody else? Well, y'all have been so nice. You're so much better than those 8th graders I tried to teach. No spitballs. I would encourage you, if you can, and you have the $20, I would like for you to at least buy a book so we can do something else the next time. Okay? Thank you for coming.